got recruited to work in an industry called foreign direct investment. Is basically economic development on a global scale. It is the ecosystem that surrounds the World Economic Forum. The way that people presume things at that level work is that there's data and research done, and then you follow the data, right? So a decision gets made, there's an agenda, and then they backfill with the supporting science or data or research.
What's the purpose of these organizations and how do they really work behind the scenes?
I spent a long time trying to decide if I should say this out loud because...
Michelle, welcome to Hosting Bitcoin.
Thank you for having me.
I'm super excited for today's discussion for multiple reasons. But before we get into the main topic du jour, I would love to enrich the audience with a little bit of your background. I've had a chance to dig in and see you've had really unique experiences that I think most people would be enlightened by. So can you tell me, how did you get into Bitcoin and what were you doing that brought you into the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I have definitely lived a relatively unique life. I kind of always did the opposite of what most people were doing. And so I've got stories to tell as a result. I spent 12 years in DC working for tech startups, like adamantly trying not to get involved in politics in any way. And ultimately, I did not want to move to Silicon Valley, so I moved to Dubai, as one does. And I worked briefly for a startup incubator there, but then I got recruited to work in an industry called foreign direct investment. And it was not anything that I had known anything about. I really had no business being in the role that I was in. I'm a good people person, and that's really, they were looking for people. I didn't know that at the time. But foreign direct investment is basically economic development on a global scale, and it is the ecosystem that surrounds the World Economic Forum. So I had been vaguely familiar with the World Economic Forum, having lived in DC, but I wasn't super familiar with it. And I suddenly was surrounded by people whose whole life goal was to be invited to this event and to be important on that level. So it was a fascinating experience. I lasted just under 2 years before I really burnt out in flames. I had fled DC to get away from the politics and the corruption and all of this nonsense, right? And somehow I ended up in like an even higher level of it. So, I guess there were lessons that I was meant to learn. And ultimately, I found Bitcoin at a free trade zone event in Cartagena, Colombia. I was sitting in a corner. I didn't want to be there. I was sitting in a corner, and there was some Russian kid who clearly also did not want to be there. So we were sitting in a corner, and he was like, have you ever heard of Bitcoin? And at the time, Ethereum, he was big into Ethereum. He was like, this is something that you can hold and that the government can't touch. So that was it. I was in on that.
This Russian kid wasn't named Vitalik, was he?
No, it was not Vitalik. I don't know his name. And I keep every 6 months I put a post out on Twitter and I'm like, if you are out there, come say hi. He was working on the Mycelium wallet. So I've met a couple people that knew other people working on that wallet back. This was in 2016, 2017. I met him in 2017. But I have no idea who it was. I went home and set up a Google alert for Bitcoin and Ethereum and just read everything that I could find. And I understood the technology first, kind of opposite from a lot of people, but I have a background in computer science and a lot of experience working for tech startups. And so to me, it was very clear that this, the software piece of it at the time, Ethereum was doing all this, they were developing and whatever. And And so I got in, and that's how I got out of foreign direct investment, was by kind of trading and ultimately like saving in Bitcoin and at the time Ethereum, which I'm fully divested from at this point. But everybody has a learning curve there.
Most people don't understand how these kind of supranational organizations work, or even that they really exist, or
Yeah.
why. What's the purpose of these organizations and how do they really work behind the scenes?
Well, the black pill in me says that the purpose is corruption, to facilitate corruption. There is, of course, a massive facade built on top of all of the corruption. Some small percentage of it may be legitimate business. So I think, economic development at a local level is positive. It's a great thing. It's necessary for communities. But when you scale up to, like you said, these, what is the word? Not even international, but like transnational.
Yeah, supranational.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, because it goes beyond international. There really is this, I don't want to use the word cabal, right? But you go to all of these events around the globe and you see the same 200 or 300 people in every room, at every meeting, at every high level. In each industry, there is an event. In real estate, there's an event called MIPIM. It's held in Cannes every year. The World Economic Forum is sort of the policy. Within the policy industry, that's the event. So these events are attended by this elite group of people, and they set policy that gets implemented at the country level, and that obviously filters down into our everyday lives, to a very serious extent. So I had fled DC trying to stay out of politics, and then gotten a crash course in why it was necessary for us, unfortunately, to be at least somewhat involved in politics, especially at the local level, because if we choose not to be involved, then it's these crazy people running their transnational groups that dictate every aspect of our lives. So I don't know that I answered your question beyond corruption. They really facilitate decision making and all of the structures that they use to implement their desired agenda. So I talk a lot about how, like, the consulting company I worked for provided data and research. And the way that people presume things at that level work is that there's data and research done, and then you follow the data, right? Kind of the same way that we followed the science during COVID. Um, and actually, it's a very similar pattern. So a decision gets made, there's an agenda, and then they backfill with the supporting science or data or research. And so all of these organizations exist to support those agendas. And again, some of them, to some extent, there may be some legitimacy. I have now in Bitcoin met people working in, you know, economic development, and we have some free trade zones. And so there's this odd crossover, and I'm like, it's an interesting experience. So,
How does this play into what you now get to do with Byte Federal? And what is Byte Federal?
yeah, so Byte Federal is a Bitcoin ATM company, one of the original Bitcoin ATM companies, and I do product development for them, which is awesome. It was like a dream job for me. How does it play into what I'm doing? I think, all of the experience that I have informs this like constant drive that I have to build products that allow people to really use Bitcoin the way that it was intended and the way that they want, right? So, regardless of how it was intended to be used, however you want or need to use Bitcoin is how you should be able to use it. And so, I have the honor of building products that hopefully enable people to do that. we were really, really in a tough position prior to the change in administration. My job had pivoted from really product development to regulation implementation. I mean, we would try to make an update in our wallet, and Google would come back and say, you can't have buttons that enable this type of functionality on your home screen. You can't have these features. And that was changing regularly. And, FinCEN was doing a lot of things, and we had to react to those enforcement by regulation, or the regulation by enforcement actions that were happening. So it has been very nice to me, regardless of one's personal political opinions. The change in regime in DC, I think, has been very good for Bitcoin, and it has been really exciting for us at Byte Federal because we have been able to pivot back to building instead of fighting politicians.
That's huge.
Yeah.
I know you've got this really unique view, having been kind of inside and around the machine, and now building literal machines to resist the machine, so to speak. How do you think about both sort of the Bitcoin ideology of fighting for freedom and independence and building things that are very counter to the existing system versus building in a way that you can work with what's already there? Because you don't have the luxury of ignoring regulation, especially when you're building financial products. So how do you square that circle?
Oh, that's a tough one. It's a really tough one. And I didn't know how tough it was until I was really in it. You know, ignorance is bliss. And people online like to say Bitcoin doesn't care. And of course, Bitcoin, the protocol, does not. But we, the people, are citizens of countries, and those countries have laws. And if you flaunt them, you are probably going to end up in jail or in trouble. So yes, we're a licensed, fully licensed MSB. We're a money services business, and so we are compliant. And it sucks sometimes.
It's not a word. Compliant is not a word that Bitcoiners like to utter.
It's not. We actually have an entire legal and compliance team that fights regulation, which is one of the things that I was most excited for when I met the guys that had started Byte Federal, is that although they were a licensed MSB and, working within the current guidelines so that they could grow a business and not all go to jail, they also had this whole group of people that were working with the regulators and working to fight what we consider unjust regulation and completely unnecessary required surveillance and things like that. So ultimately, if the existing regulatory frameworks of the fiat structure get implemented and built into the Bitcoin ecosystem, it's sort of like, well, who have we freed from what? And so while we are building products and services, we are also fighting the unconstitutional regulation. And that is my ultimate goal, is one day to see, I don't know if we can get the Bank Secrecy Act like fully abolished, but I think that we can get some of the AML KYC regulation rolled back so that it's not quite so dystopian. It's a fine line to walk, this, don't go to
One
jail.
of one of the things that you get in the Bitcoin space is this, I mean, and I totally resonate with this, is this sense of idealism. And a lot of times the ideal state is not a realistic state to try and achieve. What God love Bitcoiners, they understand a lot of things that most people don't. What do they not get about how regulation actually works when you're trying to navigate not just starting a business, but providing any kind of service in this space?
Yeah, I think one thing that is misunderstood is that if you don't want to go to jail, you do have to follow the regulation. It's really a serious thing. I mean, we see what happened with the Tornado Cash developers, the Samurai Wallet cases, and a lot of excuses are made, like, With Tornado Cash, Bitcoiners are like, oh, it's Ethereum. It has nothing to do with me. And they don't understand that the precedent is being set that will also apply to Bitcoin and Bitcoin products and services. Same goes with Samurai Wallet, those devs. All of these precedents get set and applied equally right now. Again, this is also something we're fighting, and I think we'll be successful at legally differentiating Bitcoin from crypto. But nonetheless, there will be regulation. And if you want to build anything at scale that is actually accessible for people, you have to do so within the existing regulatory frameworks. And so to me, that's why fighting those frameworks has become so extremely important. Because, I discussed our struggles with like getting updates through the Apple iTunes store, and the Bitcoiner solution is, well, just put it on put it on your website so people can download it. And I'm like, first of all, it's there. You can download, our wallet from our website. But 90%, 98% of people are never going to do that. And so we're trying to build products that are accessible to people who, aren't going to do that. And I think it's something that Bitcoiners miss is this at scale, this concept of being at scale, and how you can do anything you want if you're in your garage. But when you're doing something that people are going to actually know about and use, you have to do it within the regulatory framework. And I hate that I have to sit here and say that. There's like this anarchist in me that's like, what is wrong with you? But I regularly go through this battle of, okay, what's the alternative? The alternative is you can walk away and not build products. We saw Wallet of Satoshi, we saw Phoenix Wallet. Like, these are wallets built by devs in other parts of the world, and they are no longer available to American citizens. So I had the option to leave the country, go work for a different company. But then where does that leave my friends and my family, the people that I care about in the United States, with no products and services to use, right? And of course, you have this concept of open source anonymous development, and I fully support that. But my hesitation with that being the solution for all people is that those tools generally require a level of technological know-how that most people just don't have. And so if we want to build things for normal people, that's not always the solution.
I'd say, I mean, you do a great job. There's only so many things that you can do in terms of actually fighting just the way that the system is. Like, one of the things that I think you do well is just calling it out and just being very vocal about how it works, so that there's a light shown. Because if nobody understands how it works and what's going on, you're never going to get any kind of resources recruited to try and change it. In your opinion, what's a current regulatory battle that's going on that doesn't get enough attention but is critically important to shedding more light on?
That's a great question. And I appreciate that. I agree with that assessment that we can't fight things we don't even know exist. I would like to say that the existence of AML laws and KYC requirements is the thing that I want attention to. I don't know how realistic at this time it is to try to abolish all of that. Those are my sort of like one day dreams. But I will say, people are relatively familiar with KYC and having to sign up for an on-ramp, an exchange, or a wallet where you can buy Bitcoin and go through the KYC process. So you're providing your license and whatnot. What else is being built into the products and services that you're using is something called KYB and KYT. And I don't know if you guys have had to deal with this yet.
I've never heard of this. Please let me know what it is.
So these are also regulations that exist under the AML laws. And so KYC stands for Know Your Customer. KYB stands for Know Your Business, and KYT stands for Know Your Transaction. And a lot of people are actually very familiar with how KYT works, because if you're familiar with chain analysis, ultimately that's what KYT is the requirement of the facilitator of the transaction to run all of the addresses involved through chain analysis. These things are being built into the systems, and I think Bitcoiners are going to wake up in the future and say, like, oh shit, how did we get here? So this is something that I think really needs a light shown on it, and we need to figure out solutions so that we're not just recreating fiat structures that we send sats through.
We've all heard Bitcoin fixes this. That's probably the favorite phrase of people who really start to grok Bitcoin. What do you think are some of the problems that Bitcoin does not fix?
It doesn't fix all of this regulation, right? And for some people, it does. If you can acquire Bitcoin outside of the system, you can keep your Bitcoin outside of the system. And so far, that is not illegal to do. There was an initiative happening alongside Chokepoint 2.0. There was an effort being made to make that illegal. And Bitcoiners like to say, Bitcoin doesn't care until somebody shows up and kicks in your door, right? So Bitcoin does not fix that for most people. Again, if you have a high level of technological skill, you can always get Bitcoin in different ways. You can get it off grid, you can get it not KYC'd, but for normies, we are kind of walking into this structure where everything is KYC'd, and it's going to be, as your businesses start to use Bitcoin, it's going to be KYB'd, and as you transact more and more with your Bitcoin, it's going to be KYT'd. And I think, unfortunately, the most common reaction to this is similar to, when Snowden leaked all those docs and we found out that they were surveilling all our emails, most people just said, like, oh, well, I don't really have anything to hide in my emails, so I don't care. And, here now we are 20 years later, like, you play out all of the access and data that was provided, and you can never predict what sort of powers might be generated because of all of that information. And what I don't want to see is a recreation of that, where 10 or 15 years from now, we look back and we say, oh, we probably should have cared about that.
If we don't care about it, what's the danger?
A complete and total surveillance state, which is not a popular opinion. And I spent a long time trying to decide if I should say this out loud, because it's super doomer, right? And it's like black pilled. But at the end of the day, like, the whole reason that I am online, the whole reason that I doxed myself and told all these stories is because I think the truth matters more than anything else. And so this is the truth. And it's something that I didn't know existed until I got the job that I have and I did my government-sponsored AML KYC training, which I don't know if you guys have had to do, but at some point you will, as the industry grows and becomes more and more regulated. More people will have to do this training that I had. I have to do this every year. And it's very eye-opening. Not in a good way.
So if you're anything like me, deciding to be public and share your views was not an easy decision, but I don't think you would have done it if you didn't think that you could have an impact. So do you see a probable solution for undoing some of the regulatory mess that impinges on our freedoms?
One of the things that I am trying to do is raise awareness, because without enough people caring, I'm not sure that there's hope for it. if back in the day when Snowden leaked all the emails and stuff, if everyone had been in an uproar, we could have stopped it then. I think at this point in time, there's really no way to like roll back the freight train of big tech. And so we need enough people to care now, early in this industry, so that we can stop the implementation of the fiat rules and regulations just directly into Bitcoin as they exist. So I think there is hope if we can raise awareness, which is a big part of why I run my mouth the way that I do. Because, like you said, if people aren't aware that this is a problem, it's really hard to stop. But with enough people involved that care, I think we can at least mitigate it.
Bitcoin mining allows you to acquire Bitcoin at a lower cost than buying Bitcoin outright and produces consistent results. At Abundant Minds, we take care of setup, maintenance, and performance so that your miners can run efficiently. It's a straightforward way to grow your Bitcoin stack without the guesswork. Book a call to start now.
We're seeing a lot more national level involvement in our space. I would say largely in the good direction compared to the previous administration. But how do you feel about things like a strategic Bitcoin reserve? Is that a woohoo, like let's all celebrate, this is a really cool thing, or oh no, they're getting their grubby fingers into our space?
Well, we have certainly come a long way from separate money and state. That being said, I do think that this level of sovereign involvement was inevitable. So while I am not overly excited about it, I think it's kind of a milestone in the adoption of Bitcoin. Institutional level adoption, which we saw via the ETFs, that was inevitable. And sovereign accumulation was also inevitable. So, it's kind of like there's two sides to every coin. I'm not super excited about it. I wished that normal people had more time to accumulate Bitcoin, but also, if you know a Bitcoiner, you know that they've been screaming at you for as long as you've known them to buy Bitcoin and to get in and all of these things. And so this is just kind of like, this is how adoption works, right? I don't know exactly how old you are, but I'm old enough that when I was younger, we didn't really have the internet. We didn't have smartphones. We didn't have social media. And so I've lived through the adoption of the internet, the adoption of smartphones, the adoption of social media being a part of our everyday lives. And so there's just this natural adoption curve. And in order for Bitcoin, to continue to grow and to be a successful asset class, this really was inevitable. So I'm not excited about it. I think it does set us up for potentially even more regulation. Anything that the government deems worthy of its involvement in, we know and have seen that it can deem, therefore, worthy of additional regulation and rules and structure. And so I do have concerns about it, but I don't think it can be stopped. I think it's, a pattern of adoption.
Is it a happier alternative to our space getting regulated away and being regulated by enforcement?
It's a happier alternative to communism, which, in my opinion, was the alternative to this timeline. It's certainly a better alternative to, Choke Point 2.0, saying that Bitcoin companies cannot have bank accounts, this anti-crypto army that you had being run. It is, it couldn't be, it's at the opposite end of the spectrum to me in terms of what could have played out.
So some people would say that Bitcoin getting on the national balance sheet is like a Trojan horse for adoption and freedom. But would you take the stance of like Bitcoin being on the balance sheet is the Trojan horse for the government having more involvement in the space in a very negative way?
It's a tough question. Certainly both are possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you believe the former, then the latter doesn't really matter. If we have a Trojan horse that will ultimately force more government accountability, which to me is where I see the train going, I think ultimately we will have oil priced in Bitcoin. So the petrodollar agreement expired last year. So Petro USD is done. I think Petro BTC is somewhere on the horizon, whether it's, 6 months or 6 years or 10 years. I don't know. But to me, that's sort of the inevitability here where global commodity settlement happens in Bitcoin. And that solves a lot of the fiat nonsense that we discussed earlier that I has a front row seat to. Any type of hard money would solve this problem to some extent. There's always going to be nonsense, of course. But if we went back to a gold standard, you couldn't get away with a lot of the things that they get away with now. And I think a Bitcoin standard is in our future. I don't know that it happens anytime soon. I don't know if it will happen in our lifetimes, but the Bitcoin adoption by the governments is certainly a huge step towards that.
How do you think that plays into the reduction of government waste? Because I know that you had a chance to be pretty much boots on the ground for some of the ghost towns that were being developed in China, and I would guess are still being developed. Why do you think Bitcoin fixes that in particular?
Yeah, so I toured the ghost cities in 2016. We took a helicopter from Beijing out to the ghost towns. And I have a tweet where I posted some of the pictures, and I will never forget writing that thread. The last thing I wrote was, we all went home and pretended it was true. We pretended that those towns were 30% occupied and that next year they would be 60% occupied. I mean, it was absurd. There was no one there. But there was a huge bonus in it for everybody involved, right? Like, I was the project manager. I got a massive bonus for just going along with it. And so this is how fiat corruption works, is you're basically bribed to go along with fake towns on sovereign levels. And so Bitcoin fixes this because you can't lie at that scale when you have real money involved. So the bonus that I received, it was just dollars on a ledger in my bank account. Like, that money never really existed, right? Like, I was excited about it because I was living in fiat world. But once you have real money, you have Bitcoin, you have something that is verifiable, that cannot be printed infinitely. So China is printing money as the US is printing money. Everybody's printing money. And when you have an endless supply of something, you can do whatever you want with it. But Bitcoin, you can't print Bitcoin, right? You guys are in the mining space. You understand the proof of work that's required to facilitate Bitcoin, to create, or to have Bitcoin. There's proof of work involved in that. There's a hard money, and so you can't just bribe people to pretend things.
Mm-hmm. There's a real physical cost to generating and securing it, and it's just out of frame here, but I do have software on my bookshelf. And you let me segue into probably exactly what I wanted to talk about today, which is you had a tweet that's done pretty well. You said very briefly, I think the DoD is going to start mining Bitcoin. Why do you think that?
So the reason I tweeted that was because I saw a pattern, and some people will say that this is what I'm skilled at, is recognizing patterns. And so you had all of these accounts that are not hype people, hyping really subtly So I don't, I don't even necessarily think that I like deserve the credit for this observation, but I was just aggregating information. So you had a tweet from Sailor, who doesn't like make announcements. We have this concept of like pre-announcements of announcements and stuff. Like, it's not a thing that Sailor does, right? And you have Matthew Pines, who's at the Bitcoin Policy Institute. So all of these people were in DC for an event. And there was this like mysterious tweet about a meeting in a room somewhere in DC. This is where it all happened. So, okay, there's some sort of meeting that has happened. And then Jason Lowry updated his profile picture to an American flag. And somebody said to him, "Why did you do that?" And he was like, "Well, in 3 weeks, you'll understand why." And he has said nothing since he was silenced, right? So he was not well received. I was very new on Bitcoin when he published that book, and I didn't understand necessarily like all of the nuance and the culture and the like all of these different I don't know. I didn't understand why that book was so poorly received, and also he got a lot of like hate for it, right? And I think whether you agree with the thesis or not, it's certainly something to consider. And again, whether you agree that it's a good thing or not, he certainly had a very significant thesis and was told he wasn't allowed to discuss it, and now he has sort of said something is going to be announced. So to me, I mean, there was just this natural conclusion that like, okay, the DoD is going to mine Bitcoin. Like, you have Trump super into Bitcoin, like, and I don't know how well he actually understands it, but he does seem to understand, I think, the strategic value for the United States. And he, he's a dollar guy. So I think maybe he thinks that like Bitcoin is going to save the dollar. So there's some Trojan horse happening there, but it doesn't matter, right? Because Bitcoin's going to do what it's going to do. So you just have all of these pieces of information. And I think as the government has sought to understand Bitcoin, decided to create this strategic Bitcoin reserve, there is another piece that's been missing, which is the piece of interaction with the mining industry, right? And if you follow Bob Burnett, he talks a lot about this and how it would be very beneficial for sovereigns to be mining Bitcoin. You have template creation and off-grid Bitcoin and all kinds of different threads there that ultimately like go up the funnel to, of course, the government is going to be involved in mining Bitcoin. So I think the time has come, and I guess in 3 weeks we'll see.
I'm really interested to see what comes out. And it's kind of like the Bitcoin reserve, where it's, I think, of the directions that it could move, a more positive than not positive thing that could happen, but it comes with all of these hairy, intertwined consequences of, okay, this is now not just a financial asset, this is a defense asset. And what does that mean for regulation? What does that mean for our ability to do it as individuals and as businesses? But from the standpoint of sovereign waste, one of our most commonly and widely misused and wasted resources is energy. And most of our energy, or a good chunk of our energy, goes completely unused. And this would be a totally legitimate way of monetizing it and actually doing something with it. If Doge is here to create efficiencies on a grand scale, integrating some energy use that actually serves a purpose could be one of those things that meaningfully moves the needle.
And it would be budget neutral.
It would be budget neutral.
I am interested, so that again was really just an observation for me, and I'm interested in the thoughts about this from people like yourself that are really deeper in the Bitcoin mining space. Certainly there is a consideration of regulation that could be involved if the government adopts this, theory or understanding of Bitcoin being a defense tool. or important. So I think the strategic Bitcoin reserve to me is an economic development. The potential of the government mining Bitcoin is a defense development. And so those are very, very different pieces of the government. So ultimately, I will say, like, I don't mind being wrong if this doesn't happen. It's, again, there's two sides to the coin, right? Because if you look at what's best for the country and the future of geopolitics in 10, 20, 30, 50 years, governments that are not mining Bitcoin are probably going to be third world countries. So if we want our country to be successful, then this is really something that is inevitable, that we should want to start sooner rather than later. But it does bring about all of these questions like, okay, so what are they going to regulate around this if we do get to that point? What does that look like? And it kind of goes back to, I think the solution is similar to, we discussed like regulation around products and services, which is what I'm building. You have to create awareness first. And so I think, people in Bitcoin mining specifically, it's very important that you all speak up to the best of your abilities and make sure to be involved as these things unfold, because very critical decisions will be made, and they could have very serious trickle down effects in our own lives and our own businesses in the future.
Totally agree with that. And it's part of why we're very public about how we see the industry and try to be thought leaders as much as we can. We do, on the ground work here in Oregon, community advocacy, state level advocacy, any kind of national support that we can. Because, you saw it play out with the Bitcoin reserve, is like, if you don't have the right voices advocating for the right way to approach something, the Bitcoin reserve could have just as easily been a smattering of everything else reserve.
We got close to that.
We got really close to that. And that would have been, while not catastrophic, like a pretty dumb decision. And I think would have taken years to walk back. And only after something blew up would it have been recognized that was a really dumb move. So I think we're on the happier timeline in that case. And I would say it's the same thing for the DoD getting involved in mining Bitcoin. Is the way that they approach it is the key here. If it's nobody can have arms except for the DoD, that's a big problem. If it's a portfolio of public-private partnerships, then that's a much happier world to live in. And then at least you've got many different private organizations that are having a voice and able to exert some amount of influence on how this gets implemented, what the impacts are. It's going to be an implementation thing. I think, to your point, it's inevitable. It's coming. The question is, can we steer it in the direction that it's going to be positive and a win-win-win for everybody?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And the time is now. A lot of people want to hold their Bitcoin and not be involved, and I was very much one of them. But like we discussed earlier, you've got to be involved because there are really serious decisions being made, and it's up to us to steer them in the correct direction.
One of my early business coaches told me something that stuck with me for years, which is, without responsibility, there's no freedom. And if you're given a freedom, you have a responsibility to care for that, protect it, maintain it. Why do you think it's so important for people to get involved if they want to protect their freedoms?
Yeah, so I would very much agree with that freedom comes with responsibility. And so if we want to enjoy the freedom that Bitcoin can provide, we have to take on the responsibility of protecting Bitcoin and in turn protecting Bitcoiners and people that are using Bitcoin.
There's a whole class of people that, when you talk about having sovereign money having the ability to be financially sovereign don't want it and are very resistant to taking ownership of their future in that way. What is the danger for the people who don't embrace their freedom and take ownership of it?
Well, unfortunately, you are correct. There are a lot of people that don't care, people that don't care that their emails are being surveyed, right? These are the same people who probably don't care that their money's not in the bank. Well, the danger is that you can have, no control over your life. I mean, we know what the global agendas are, that you will own nothing, you will live in a 15-minute city, you won't travel. These are not really conspiracy theories. They are very well documented agendas coming out of the World Economic Forum and the associated policy institutes. So the danger is that you will be forced into this life of fake comfort where, you're just a consumer and you're maybe living in a pod, maybe just living in a tiny little apartment and eating the junk that they put on the shelf at the store. And the danger is having no other option from that. I mean, if that makes you happy and you want to do that, then of course you're free to do that. But I don't know that anyone is truly happy living that way. All the people I know still living that way are really miserable and trying to plan an escape. And that's all well and fine until one day you're not allowed to escape. One day you're not allowed to leave your 15-minute boundary without the proper identification or, rules that you followed or whatever it may be. I mean, society already functions this way in places like China, and even to some extent, it's growing in the West. So the danger is just being a subject to a totalitarian government that doesn't care what you want to do.
What do you hope that your impact on that trend is? Or just your impact in general as an individual?
Well, I hope that I inspire people to leave the cities and get chickens and bathe in the sunlight and tell the government to fuck off. That's my ultimate goal. And, I didn't really, my experience on Twitter has evolved. And I didn't know what to expect when I came out and decided to go public with this story, all of these stories. The reaction, I could have never predicted the reaction. So in where I was coming from, I was speaking to Bitcoiners and connecting with Bitcoiners who kind of were really aware of a lot of the things I was talking about. So that was my target audience, right? Was you guys. I know that it's crazy, but it's actually even crazier. And the thing that I could have never predicted and still to this day inspires me and drives me is that the number one thing that people say to me is, thank you for saying the things that I feel like I can't say. And I was shocked to get that from some of the people that I got that from. There are some very loud mouths online with very large followings that, for one reason or another, and in most of the cases I understand the reason, feel like they can't be completely honest with the things that they think. And that just blew my mind. And so any semblance of reserve or self-censorship that I might have had went completely out the window, and I went totally off the rails. Look, you guys, y'all need to speak the fuck up, because if Bitcoiners are not being honest, right, then what hope do we have left for humanity? I mean, to me, none. If we, the people who understand that everything is a lie, if we cannot be honest, who is going to be honest? So to me, really, it's not even about my opinions and my loud mouth. It's about whatever your opinion is, please say it. And if enough people are loud enough with their various opinions, I think we can drag society back to a place where debate becomes normal. Disagreements are okay and conversations are normalized. Like all of these things have really disappeared from society. And so that is what I'm trying to like push back into the world.
I love that. I love that so much. Very healthy perspective. And for the people who don't feel like they have a voice, I want to say thank you for giving a voice to the things that need to be said, because it takes courage. It's not without risk. And it's one of the most important missions that people are given, is to speak truth to power and keep on beating the drum of how they know it really works, so that someone has the opportunity to go along and change it.
Well, I appreciate that. And I will just say one more time, if there's anything that you are afraid to say it. And you don't have to scream it the way that I do. You don't have to use your curse words. You can tame it down. You don't have to go full tilt. But just be brave and say the things you really think, because so many more people think them, and so bravery, I think, inspires bravery. And so if I can inspire people to speak up, I don't care if you agree with me or not, right? Like, just say whatever you're afraid to say, and then you're going to inspire more people. And then all of a sudden, there's no reason to be afraid. Like, if everyone just spoke up, the fear of speaking up would go away because everyone is doing it. So it's important.
Beautiful. Michelle, I've really enjoyed having you on and had a wonderful time getting to chat with you. Would
Thank
you
you.
please tell our listeners where they can find you, where they can keep up with what you're working on, what's new for you, and how they can keep up with Michelle Weekley?
Yeah, so I am just on Twitter. It's my name, Michelle Weekley. I have one account. I don't have any other accounts. I am on Nostr. I'm not very active there yet. I'm working on it. But right now I'm primarily on Twitter, X. Terrible rebrand. That's where you can follow me. I do not have any other social media accounts, so, if you get DMs, they are not from me.
Love it. Everybody keep up with what Michelle's working on, and thank you again for your time. Until next time, appreciate you hanging out.
Thank you for having me.